Thank you, and welcome to today's webinar to mark World Soil Day. The webinar is co-hosted by Soils at Guelph and the Greenbelt Foundation with support from OMAFA, the Soil Health Institute, and Homes Agro. So thanks for tuning in. Did you know that the first World Soil Day happened 10 years ago? It's an initiative of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And it's a chance to focus attention on the importance of healthy soil, sustainable management of soil resources, and food security. So thank you for joining us. My name is Heather White, and I'm the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with Soils at Guelph. Today actually marks our 6th anniversary as an initiative of the University of Guelph. We support science-backed sustainable soil management by facilitating knowledge exchange and the connections that drive action. We have a website because you're not real these days if you don't have a website. So you can visit the website if you'd like to know more about us. Additionally, I'll be speaking at the end of the webinar about our ground truthing project. So stay tuned for how our project can help pay for your soil health analysis in 2025. As for now, I'm pleased to be your MC for today. There we go. With the Made in Ontario Soil Health Testing webinar. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including Jake and Dan from OMAFA, as well as Jenny, Ryan, and Adam from the Soil Health Institute and the Greenbelt Soil Health Program. Throughout the session, we'll be discussing projects that are helping to build capacity across the province to measure, monitor, and manage soil health, which happens to be the 2024 theme for World Soil Day. Then at the end of the webinar, we'll also share information on how you can get involved with soil health programs in 2025. But before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items to cover. First of all, this webinar will be recorded and posted up on YouTube through the Greenbelt Foundation's website and eventually through our website. If you're tuning in as a certified crop advisor looking for soil and water management credits, we'll be posting a QR code at the end of the webinar for you to connect with, and only those who are tuned in live with us are eligible for those credits. Finally, if you're tuning in as a farmer looking for knowledge sharing event credits for the nitrogen management or cover cropping, a link for that program will also be posted at the end of the webinar. One more thing, if you have any questions for our speakers today, please type them in the Q&A spot within Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout the webinar. And without further ado, I'd like to call to the mic, so to speak, Jake Monroe and Dan Surrett of the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness. Jake will begin by providing a bit of a background to the provincial soil health testing in the province, and then Dan will speak more specifically about the Ontario Top Soil Sampling Program. So take it away, Jake.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather, and good afternoon, everybody. I recognize a lot of names on the participant list there, so nice to see you all. And I'm very briefly going to give a little bit of background, like Heather said, some context on efforts to develop an Ontario soil health test, and then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Dan to talk about some really exciting results from the recently completed Ontario Top Soil Sampling Project. Okay, next slide. All right, just a couple of photos to set the stage here for why soil health testing is important and of value. These two soils that you can see on your screen are located just basically across the fence row from one another in Norfolk County, just basically neighboring fields that have been managed very differently over the past number of decades. You can see the soil on the left looks a little bit lighter in color. You can see, if you look closely, you can see mud on the boots. This was after a rain event the day prior. Whereas the soil on the right, darker colored, no mud on the boots, lots of residue cover, and what seems to be some nice soil structure. And so, we know as crop advisors or growers, we kind of just know inherently doesn't take much digging or looking to get a sense of what's a healthy soil. And if you click once more, you'll see here, we do have some excellent, sorts of demonstration tools that will kind of bear this out further. So here I did take a sample of soil from each of these, brought it to the University of Guelph Soil and Crop Club back a couple of falls ago, and showed them the impact that soil management can have on soil function, in this case, slaking and aggregate stability of soils. You can see, massive impact of a soil that's been managed poorly versus one that's been managed well with rotation, cover crops, reduced tillage, and those sorts of practices. But why we're really interested in soil health testing and developing an Ontario soil health test is we would ideally like to put some numbers to that difference in management, quantify it, and give both growers and farm advisors some data to work with to inform decision making moving forward. Perfect. So we're fortunate in Ontario to have a really strong foundation to build off of when it comes to evaluating soil health testing. Dr. Laura Van Aert and colleagues started evaluating the Cornell soil health test back about a decade ago. Had a couple of really good publications where they sampled at some of the long-term tillage and rotation trials across the province and found that, yes, soil health testing can do a pretty decent job of differentiating amongst different management practices. They found that no-till as well as wheat or alfalfa-based rotations tended to boost scores, but they also identified that there are opportunities to kind of improve upon the soil health testing that was out there and also to tailor scoring to Ontario conditions. Okay, so add on to that, there was, as many of you are probably aware, about 6 years ago, the release of the Ontario Agricultural Soil Health and Conservation Strategy. And it was developed as basically as a guide to help inform research investments, activities, and efforts around soil health from 2018 through to 2030. Had 4 themes and a whack load of actions, 84 actions. Action number 44 was very specific, asking for the development and implementation of a comprehensive Ontario soil health test. So that's part of what got this ball rolling. Next slide. So out of that, and in the basically past 4 or 5 years, in the kind of wake of the soil strategy, a group of us at OMAFRA have been developing SHAP, the Soil Health Assessment and Plan. It's a detailed risk assessment tool with in-field, online, and soil health test components. And really at the core of it is the soil health test. It's got the 5 indicators that you can see on the screen. Not going to go into detail on them now. Dan's going to talk more on some of these indicators. But the overall goal with the soil health test is to help growers benchmark over time, benchmark changes, improvements, and also to allow Ontario farmers to compare their field to other fields with similar properties and similar soil texture. Okay, last slide for me. This is just a very quick kind of timeline on the development over the past 4 or 5 years on an Ontario soil health test. So very quickly, 2020, we put the call out to the accredited labs within Ontario to bid on doing some kind of initial analyses for those 5 indicators, as well as some method development. The University of Guelph Lab Services Department was the successful lab, and that's who's been doing the work since then. In 2021 and 22, we had an initial sampling campaign where we collected just over 200 samples and kind of got the ball rolling on that. But then building on that has been a whole bunch of other activities. So you're going to hear from Dan about the Ontario Topsoil Sampling Project, where we've had 1,500 samples added to this database. And then, of course, we've got 2 projects that have come online in the last year or 2, which is Soils at Guelph Ground Truthing SHAP projects with a goal of adding 1,000 samples by 2025, and the Greenbelt project, which is going to be adding 300 samples by 2025. Add on to that the 500 that Dan's planning to do with additional soil survey work, and by 2026, the objective is to have an available Ontario soil health test for general use that's underpinned by a really robust database that is going to have well over 3,000 samples and going to allow growers to kind of compare themselves to others within the province. So I will leave it there, and I'm going to pass it over to Dan for some more on the Ontario Topsoil Sampling Project.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. That's a really good introduction to what we're going to look at for the Topsoil Sampling Project. So the project was initiated in 2019, and the objective was really to understand the variability of topsoil properties and characteristics across Ontario, or agricultural portions of Ontario. We want to look at landscape variables, and the range and variability of soil properties within a field. So not only looking at 1 sample per field, we're looking at multiple samples per field to try to get a range of values, and then establish some baselines for different soil properties and soil health indicators. So those 5 soil health indicators. Go ahead, next slide. Thanks. So we selected, in total, we ended up with 504 farms. They were selected using a statistical approach which considered different variables that we know control soil health or soil variability across our landscapes. So we had things like topography, we used cropping information, we used surficial geology information, and we even used the existing soil maps to try to represent the soils as best we could within Ontario with a limited sample of only 504 farms. And then again, within each farm, we did 3 samples to represent different landscape positions. So if there's, if there's an undulating landscape, we can sample in upper, mid, and lower slope positions. Areas of the province that are more level, we were just separating our sampling by about a minimum of 50 meters to ensure that we had we could try to capture some variability within the field. Next slide. Perfect. So we talked a little bit about the soil health indicators previously, or Jake did. So there's 5 here, and I always sneak in bulk density. Soil organic matter, we'll just kind of go over these very briefly, but soil organic matter is really the sum of all the organic materials in soil, and I think a lot of people are quite familiar with what soil organic matter tests look like, and there's the next one is active carbon. So active carbon is a fraction of soil organic carbon that's moderately stable. And so it responds more quickly to management changes. And so we can kind of look at that one maybe as a leading indicator of changes in soil organic carbon. Soil respiration. So soil respiration is just that. We're just measuring how much CO2 a soil sample is creating over in our case, a 96-hour window. Tells us something about how biologically active the soil is. Potentially mineralizable nitrogen measures how much nitrogen tied up in the organic matter is converted into plant available ammonium nitrogen. So it's kind of the soil's natural ability to provide available nitrogen to the crops. Aggregate stability refers to the resistance of soil aggregates to disintegration. And so we know that, increases in things like organic matter helps build stronger soil aggregates, and then they resist disintegration or falling apart. And Jake showed a really great example of the slaking test in 2 different soils. And the one that I add is bulk density. So we measured bulk density at all of our sites, and we talk a lot about compaction being an issue in Ontario soils, and bulk density can be used as a proxy for looking at compaction, right? So lower bulk density means there's more void space in your soil, and so that would indicate a better soil condition than something that has a high density. Next slide. So one of the things that we know from previous work, and then also we'll see from our work, is that texture exhibits a considerable control on soil processes and on inherent soil properties. And so for our analysis, we followed, this is the same breakdown of the texture triangle that we would see from the Cornell approach, where we've regrouped into kind of 3 broader texture groups: the coarse soils, so the sandy loams, loamy sands, and sands, and then the fine soils, which are at the clay-rich end, and then the loamy soils or the medium soils, which are kind of down through the middle of that texture triangle. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of the results over the next slide. All right, so we're going to look at these. We're going to look at these individually. So we're going to look first at soil health indicators as a function of texture. And so I'm not going to go through each one of these in great detail. We're just going to kind of look at some general trends. So we can see here, soil texture really controls other inherent soil properties, including the soil health indicators. If we can look at the trend, so how the box plots kind of move up as you go from coarse to fine. So the soil health indicators really, they're increasing from coarse to fine textured soils. And so the clay-rich soils have have inherently higher soil health indicator values. Click for the animation, Ryan. This is magic. There we go. And so we can see here that this becomes important for interpreting, right? So we know that the coarser textured soils are not going to necessarily be able to achieve the same soil health scores maybe as clay-rich soils. The one difference you see here is the bulk density. I think, Ryan, one more time, you'll see the arrows going in the opposite direction. So in the case of bulk density, lower bulk density is would indicate better soil health. And so we can see that the fine textured soils, the trend for bulk density is the opposite when we're looking at bulk density. All right, next one. Perfect. So in terms of landscape position, this one is maybe not as apparent, but location within the landscape does also control soil health indicator values to some extent. Lower slopes tend to have higher values, and the upper slopes tend to have the lower values, right? So this is something that maybe is important to know when we're deciding, for example, where we're going to sample for soil health. I think if you go one more round, you'll see the arrows pop up. And then again, the bulk density is opposite to all of the other soil health indicators. It's important to consider where you're doing your soil health sampling in the field if you're going to do it. And if you're going to repeat soil health sampling within a field to track soil health changes over time, you want to make sure that you're sampling from the same landscape positions, right? So you wouldn't want to go in year one sampling from a knoll that's maybe got lower soil health, and then go back 3 years later and sample in a low area where we know that the low area has got all the good topsoil that's moved down the slope, for example, and it's going to have higher soil health scores, right? That's not going to tell you anything about how it's changing. And so just always remember to think about where the sampling is occurring and what you're trying to show with that information. Next, yeah. And then in terms of cropping systems, so the cropping system certainly affects the potential for soil health indicators as well. What we can see essentially is that the more perennialized an agricultural system is, the higher the inherent soil health indicator values can be. So this is important when you're considering, for example, the soil health potential of soils in different cropping systems. We certainly know that, it's not likely that we can have the same outcomes in, perennial pasture systems that we're going to have in, in a grain cropping system. 2 clicks. Sorry, my magic arrows. All right, so how do we interpret soil health? So this is what we were building our database for from the topsoil sampling project, is to be able to provide some interpretation of those numbers. So what does it mean if I have an organic matter content of 2? For most of the indicators that we're going to look at, the approach that we're using is, in this case, a more is better. So a high measured value implies a higher score. The bulk density is the opposite, less is better. So a lower measured value implies a higher score. And the one thing we're able to show is that we need to develop Ontario-specific scoring systems to properly interpret the data. We've compared our ranges of values to other systems, for example, the Cornell assessment, and the ranges of our values aren't the same, and so we need some Ontario-specific data to do the interpretation properly. Next. So this is just an example. We're just showing you one example with soil organic matter. These are what the interpretive plots look like. Essentially, all we're doing is we're rescaling the lab data that we've obtained through the topsoil sampling program or project to a scale from 0 to 100. And this allows us to determine a score for any value in soil organic matter. In this case, it's separated into 5 zones, right? All 20% of the data, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So we're just splitting it up into 5 zones of equal width that go from very low to very high. And so one more click, I think. And in some cases, there are multiple curves on the plot, in other cases, there aren't. And that has to do with whether or not there's justification for having different scoring curves for different soil textures. So we're just going to walk through this one example with soil organic matter. So for example, in this plot, if I got my lab results back and it said you have 5% organic matter in that soil sample, I would then be able to look at this plot and I would just draw that line, vertical line straight up from there. And wherever it crosses the curve of the right texture is how I interpret my score. So in this case, if I had 5% and my soil texture was coarse, I would have, they're backwards, I'm sorry, fine textured at 5%. The fine textured curve is right here. You would have a score of 50. And then if you had a medium textured soil right here, you would have a score of 70. If you had a coarse textured soil, we would have a score of 90. And that kind of shows you the inherent ability for finer textured or clay-rich soils to hold organic matter. Next. All right, that's the end of my slides, but we released our Ontario Topsoil Sampling Project Report today. That's the QR code on the right over the cover of the report, so feel free to grab that and read and fire away any questions you might have. And then the SHAP website is also up on Field Crop News, and that's the other QR code that's on the left. And Jake and I are always available to answer your soil health questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Dan and Jake. That was awesome. Next, I want to move into a section about the Greenbelt and SHI project. So my name is Ryan Carlo. I'm the soil health specialist with the Greenbelt Foundation. And I'm going to be talking to you about the work that we've been doing in the Golden Horseshoe region with our project, which is Healthy Soils for Sustainable Farms. So this project is really a partnership between the Greenbelt Foundation and the Soil Health Institute, as well as many Ontario agricultural partners. It's a 4-year program that launched last year in 2023 and will continue until 2026. We are supported by an advisory committee and 2 subcommittees with representation from many different Ontario agricultural organizations, including the Certified Crop Advisors Association of Ontario. So thank you very much for your ongoing advice and support. The project has 2 main areas of focus. The first one being benchmarking the Golden Horseshoe region for soil health metrics through soil health testing. And the second is educating producers and advisors such as yourselves on soil health testing and BMPs. So in terms of soil sampling, our project has taken us all across the Golden Horseshoe for the last 2 years. And this is a little bit about what soil health sampling looks like. For us in our program, we looked at one central location in the field, but there's also the opportunity if you're doing soil health sampling on your own to look at 2 areas that you're looking to compare that may be different based on slope or on yield or anything like that. We used a soil probe to produce about 20 to 30 soil cores from 0 to 15 centimeters in depth. And all of those cores are collected within a circle of a 3-meter radius at that central location. Because we're working with the Soil Health Institute and focused on more of a research side, we also collected 2 bulk density cores going down to 30 centimeters. And we used a sieve for aggregate calculation or collection as well. The sampling cores were combined into the same bag and were shipped to the Agriculture and Food Laboratories in Guelph. So the exciting thing about the work here in Ontario is that Soils at Guelph project, our project, and the Topsoil project, all of the samples are being collected and sent to AFL lab. So everything's being run at the same lab, so it'll make comparisons much easier. In our project, we were looking at soil grouping. So with help from the Soil Health Institute, they've taken the soil texture triangle and brought it down to 6 related soil groupings, of which 4 are shown here on the map of the Golden Horseshoe. So the majority of the soils in this region are covered by that pink color, which is coarse loamy soils. These are sandy loams, or silt loams. The second largest category is fine loamy soils. These are loams, clay loams, and sandy clay loams. And then there's 2 additional categories, which are really geographically located in the region. In Hamilton, there's a large amount of fine silty soils that are really high in silt. And then Niagara, there's obviously a lot more clay soils. So we sampled those 2 as well to make sure our project had really good geographical distribution of samples. So next, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Dr. Jenny Bauer from the Soil Health Institute, to talk about some of the results from our work.
Thanks, Ryan. So as Dan Surratt and others have mentioned, a guiding question is, is my soil healthy? So if we receive results from the lab, like an organic matter percentage of 4% or carbon of 2%, respiration value of 25, an aggregate stability number of 72, what does that mean? And for that, we need to add context to those values. And so to do this, we need to first sort out those soil properties that Dan mentioned influence our soil health indicators, but we also can kind of layer on some added value by understanding how management practices specifically influence soil health. So this gets to the question, how much healthier can my soil get? How much can it improve? And these associated questions of how much progress have we achieved through adoption of BMPs, or how much progress could we achieve? And then how much total improvement is possible? So what's the maximum soil health potential for that soil? And when thinking about this, we really want to have an eye towards soil functions, which is part of that goal of soil health improvement and assessment. The soil in this image has a really nice granular topsoil structure, and it's got that crumb-like porosity, which is built by earthworms and other organisms, and is definitely a sign of healthy soil. So for our approach, we grouped common soil types based on particle size class, but also selected common management practices. And the reason for this was to set up an experimental design that would allow us to quantify the effects of management practices after controlling for soil properties like texture and drainage. And so this is basically a space for time substitution. So by sampling similar soils under different managements, we want to allow folks to understand how much progress they might be able to make by adopting BMPs. So if I'm a farmer, I can say, here's how much I can potentially increase my organic matter by adding more cover crops and reducing my tillage. We also, and so this would be represented by the graph on the right. So soil organic matter, or carbon, is on the vertical axis. Carbon is about half of organic matter. And then on the lower axis, we've got clay. And as Dan Surratt mentioned, we expect higher organic matter at higher clay contents. But here, what I want to point out, we've got this golden line that represents soil without BMPs, whereas the blue line, we've added some best management practices. And you can see that we can quantify that progress, and that the actual values of organic matter will change depending on that clay content. So this gives us a way to estimate just how much we can improve by adopting management practices. We can also compare where our soil is at with the overall soil health capacity of the soil. And so that would be represented by, say, a soil that has been undisturbed, maybe has perennial cover for a long time, just because we know there's an upper threshold for all of our soil health indicators on improving that soil health capacity. Next slide. And we can think of that as the innovation space. So, maybe we haven't quite maximized our potential for cover cropping or additional BMPs. So what do we know the soil can do, and how far away are we from that? Next slide. So 161 sites have been sampled at this point in 2024 across Niagara, York, Durham, and a cluster in Kawartha Lakes. But over the 2 years, 285 sites have been sampled, and these encompass those fine loamy and coarse loamy soils, and there are some additional soil types that we're working on. So these are distributed throughout all 6 Golden Horseshoe regions and the surrounding areas. The managements we chose included 75 baseline sites. The image at left, upper left. These represented corn and soy rotations, some with wheat, most with annual full width tillage. There were 85 what we would call soil health management sites, although these labels aren't very useful. And these represented corn, soy, wheat with cover crops. Around 64% had cover crops. And the remaining were no-till or a very infrequent tillage. We also sampled 102 long-term undisturbed perennial sites. Next slide. So based on our first year of data, and after correcting for those soil properties that I've been discussing, the top 15 centimeters of soil in fields managed with reductions in tillage and additions of cover crops showed an average of 23% higher soil organic carbon or organic matter than the soils without BMPs. We saw 26% higher permanganate oxidizable carbon or active carbon, pretty similar, and then 28% higher respiration. So these are just our carbon indicators, but I wanted to show how we can quantify this. And when you think about what this means for the actual values, just note that this would be different in a sandy soil versus a clayey soil, but that proportion would remain the same based on our modeling. Next slide. And then when we compare those soils without best management practices, we see an even larger gap between what we know the soil can actually achieve under long-term perennials without disturbance. And so when we compare those soils, we know that 84% higher soil organic matter is possible, 66% higher active carbon, and almost 150% higher respiration. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, we can then take our ability to quantify changes in management and use that within farmer reports. So it's similar and right alongside the SHAP framework, we can show the predicted average for a given soil health indicator for each management grouping for your soil type. And so and here, this is represented by the brown, kind of yellowish and green bars, with the green bar representing undisturbed perennial vegetation, the yellow representing low tillage with cover crops, and the brown representing higher tillage. And you know, say I'm just starting out with soil testing and thinking about this. I test my soil in a representative area using the protocol Ryan mentioned, and my result here is in red. So now I can see, you know, if I started introducing cover crops and reducing my tillage, I could expect to achieve maybe that close to that yellow bar with time, and I would want to continue potentially soil testing to see that improvement. Okay, in summary, we sampled common soils and management practices in the Golden Horseshoe and assessed these through a suite of soil health indicators, including SHAP. And then we hope to add to the existing framework by measuring soil health of soils under different management, so we can know how much progress has been achieved and how much is possible. And then using all of this to allow producers to interpret their own soil health and facilitate goals. Back to you, Ryan.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jenny. That was great. So in addition to providing the soil health test to the individual producers in our sampling project, we're also gathering 5 years of previous management history in order to calculate some of the behind-the-scenes indices that go into creating the final soil health report. And in doing that management collection with the farmers, we gathered some data about the current cover crops that are going on the ground. And Dan's rep provided us a really great graph about some similar information that they found in the topsoil project. So just from our project here is the pie chart on the left of the screen, and on the right of the screen is the pie chart from the topsoil sampling project. So in the Greenbelt project, we found that about 49% of producers in annual cropping systems were not using cover crops, and that was about 51% in the topsoil program. We had 38% of our producers using single species cover crop, and that was 29% in topsoil. 6% were using a simple mix of 2 to 5 species, and that was 12% in the topsoil program. And then the complex mix of more than 5 species in a cover crop mix, we had 7% of sites in our testing showing that system, and it was about 2% in the topsoil program. So very similar numbers, and I'd be curious to see about if you think in your own regions that you're working in, if that's a pretty representative numbers for your areas as well. So within our project, obviously the most common use of cover crops is that single species. It's generally red clover or oats after winter wheat, which is a really great time to introduce cover crops to someone who it's new to. And because the soil is exposed for longer after wheat harvest, it's really great to get those roots down and get that soil protected over the rest of the summer and the fall. We have a few producers that are using rye after wheat going into corn, or after corn going into soybeans, and they are finding success with that system. We also have a few producers that are planting green, and those are the ones that have the multi-species cover crop mix in all the years that they can, generally including species like radish, sunflowers, vetch, and a bunch of others. Obviously, that's a more height maintenance system, but for those growers, they're finding success with it. One interesting thing we're seeing more of in our conversations with growers, and I'm sure you are too, is that those with animals are finding a really good use for the rye cover crop that's grown over the winter, as they can add it to their feed in the spring. So thinking of different ways to make that cover crop do double duty by protecting the soil over the winter, but also providing the economic benefit of getting some feed in the spring when you really need it. Other reasons our producers are using cover crops: it's good weed suppression, really good protection of the soil over that critical fall and winter period. And it's also working the ground. So we are working with a number of producers who are obviously no-till or using minimum tillage systems. And adding the extra roots from the cover crop really allows those roots to do the work instead of the equipment in the soil. So that was a little bit about our project. Really happy with the results so far, and we'll have more information coming out soon. Just wanted to thank all of our partners, including the Certified Crop Advisors Association of Ontario and Soils at Guelph. Thank you so much for all your help. And then thank you to our funders from the project, the Weston Family Foundation and the Government of Ontario. So moving into the next session of the webinar, I'm going to invite Adam Hayes to come forward. Adam is a former soil specialist with OMAFRA, now a soil consultant, and he's been working on the Greenbelt project with us for the last 2 years, providing help doing soil sampling, but also developing our soil health management plans. So these plans came about trying to fill in the next step of the soil health test. So we provide farmers with soil health testing, but where do we go from there? This is our answer to that question, and Adam's going to present his work on that with us.
Thanks, Ryan. So the soil health management plan process is, and similar to SHAP that was mentioned earlier, starts with talking to the farmer about what their soil health concerns are, what fields they have that they might want to see sampling, either to get a baseline on, or whether they're seeing some issues and want to get some further answers. And then it's talking to them about their cropping and tillage systems, their nutrient management, and use of cover crops and that sort of thing to get a sense of what they're doing. Then we go to the field and do the soil sampling of those indicators mentioned, as well as doing some field observations for if there's some erosion in the field, looking for crusting, soil structure issues, earthworms, that sort of thing. Then we get those results back, and the scoring is done, as you saw from the SHAP numbers, scores out of 100 for those, and some other evaluation of some of the soil health indicators that were done. From there, it's looking at developing recommendations, basically putting together that soil health management plan for the farmer. So taking those indicator numbers, the management, and some of the soil observations, rating those, trying to match them up with the BMPs, and then putting forth the recommendations or suggestions for BMPs that could be incorporated to try and improve the health of their soils. Then, as with SHAP and within the Greenbelt project, the reports went back to the farmers, and there was discussion to see if the recommendations fit with what they might be interested in doing, and talking with them about resources or incentives that might be available to help them implement those. And then lastly, once that's revised, then they have a plan to go forward and implement those actions, potentially accessing incentives and getting potentially peer support or other help for that. So for the Greenbelt project, we had as I mentioned, the information we'd collected from the field, but with SHOP, there's an agronomist usually that puts the soil health plan together, but we didn't have that with the Greenbelt project. So I was asked to develop a rating tool that could be used to take those indicator values and the management information along with the other observations and do a rating of those that we could then put into a rating to BMP table that would come up with suggestions or recommended practices that the farmer could consider to improve either some or a few or multiple issues with soil health on that field. And that became the soil health management plan. Next slide. As a starting point to try and visualize what visualize the management on each of these fields, we put a table together. As Ryan mentioned, there was 5 years of cropping and tillage information collected. So the crop rotation is visualized, whether cover crops are used, what the tillage system was each year, and whether organic amendments were applied to the field each of those years. We also had the erosion observations and the other soil observations that could be were recorded as well. Next slide. So this is an example of one section of the rating tool that was developed, and it's basically, an agronomist would go through this in their head and sort of see whether what they were doing, if it was being used for SHOP, what the grower was doing, and see where it kind of fit in their head from a scale from a good practices to ones that weren't quite as good for soil health. So what we have here, the first row is the soil organic matter score from the SHOP analysis. And so we broke it into, for the Greenbelt project, we broke into 4 categories as Jake and Dan mentioned. The scoring with the SHOP is broken into 5 categories, but we just took the scores and put it into 4 categories. So in this case, the organic matter score was 20, which came out as very low in our rating system. Then in SHOP and also in the soil health Greenbelt project, there was a soil tillage intensity rating is an option in SHOP. It was done on all of the ones in the soil health, the Greenbelt project. And so in this case, with the example above, there was a fair bit of tillage, so the score came out on the low end at 24. Then the next 3 are based on the cropping practices. So crop rotation is the next one. And from the example above, there was a couple of years of cereals grown in there. So that gave it a rating of 4 or high from a soil building perspective for soil health. The next one was cover crop use, there were no cover crops in the 5-year period of time. So it got a rating of 1. And there was also no organic amendments used. So it got a 1 as there were none there. Overall, we gave an overall rating for each section. So the soil organic matter in this one came out to an 8, which ended up as a low score for organic matter for that field. Next slide. So then what we did was take those ratings and put them into a rating to soil management practices tool, which again is somebody, an agronomist doing it in SHAP, would go through this in their mind and look at what practices they might do to move the person up from a soil health perspective. With this one, the tillage rating was low, or was very low. So you can see in that row, the recommendation would be to move to a less intensive form of tillage or reduce the number of passes. For the cover crops, again, they weren't used, so it was a very low rating. So it suggests trying to include a cover crop in or following a crop once in 5 years. And if you're agronomist looking at this, you might say, well, that's not really giving the person a very detailed recommendation, but you have to keep in mind that we, asked these basic questions. We really didn't have an opportunity to get to know what the grower was doing beyond that to give more detailed recommendations to the grower. And so what we were trying to do with this was move them up a category in that what you saw on the rating previously. So if they were very low, we were trying to at least move them up to a low rating for that. And if they wanted to do, if they're willing to, work with us and do more, then we'd certainly try to push them to a higher category. Next slide. So the SHAP Soil Health Management Plan, if you haven't seen it, this is what it looks like. It's broken into, there's 3 rows and 3 columns. And so it looks at early wins, what can be done fairly easily, implemented fairly soon, short term, sort of that 2 to 5 year period of time, and then the long term, sort of 5 years on, what would the goals be for that? And then it looks at what the actions are, what concerns are being addressed, and considerations or suggestions of BMPs that could be implemented to improve soil health. So in this case, with that higher amount of tillage, the suggestion is to reduce tillage intensity or frequency. So that's trying to address the soil structure that wasn't quite so good, the low organic matter levels in that field. And so it's suggesting that they reduce tillage to a minimum, or reduce tillage to ensure a minimum of 30% soil cover all year long to try and help with those issues. A bit longer term, trying to integrate cover crops, again, to address those low soil organic matter levels, improve soil structure, and protect that soil from water erosion. So then the suggestion is determine adjustments necessary to include a cover crop in the current cropping system, give them a bit of time to think about how they might be able to implement that in their cropping system. And then longer term goals, says that organic amendments, the longer term goal could be to increase soil organic matter levels. So that's also going to improve soil structure and soil life. So then try, in a longer period of time, try to work towards sourcing an organic amendment that could be applied to that field. Next. So for the Greenbelt Soil Health Project, there you get there's a 4-page report that has the values of the indicators and the scoring. And then the final page of that has some things that they should continue doing, some good practices that they're already doing, and then some that they consider to try and improve their soil health. And then there's the soil health management plan is the last thing on that, along with some suggestions for resources or incentives. So if you're doing SHAP and you don't have this rating table, there's and with if an agronomist do it, you're obviously going to put more detailed information into it. The SHAP in the SHAP guide, they have a number of pages with suggestions. In this case, it's integrating cover crops, a number of the first, the middle column is rationale for why a grower might want to do that. And then the column on the right gives some short, medium, and long-term actions that the farmer could consider implementing, things that they should think about if they're considering adding cover crops to the system. Next. So I was asked to talk a little bit about integrating cover crops into the rotation. If somebody's thinking about that who hasn't done it before, certainly need to consider the goals and objectives for the cover crop. And Ryan talked about a number of these benefits that the farmers were seeing. You know, determining what they want to do. If it's soil loosening, you're going to choose a species with deeper roots. Erosion prevention, something that's going to cover the ground quickly. Excuse me. And so that helps determine the species and maybe the timing of the cover crop implementation. The next thing is the cropping and tillage system. How much time is there for a cover crop to grow after the crop harvest? Is it, you know, is there a lot of corn? Is there a short season afterwards? Or do you have is there cereals or corn silage that comes off earlier that could give more time? The other thing is the labor. Excuse me. It's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to plant a cover crop, but if there's really not much time or labor available, it's hard to get that established. Next is timing. When do you want to do that? Is it going to be after harvest? Try to interseed a crop, or is it something you might frost seed like the red clover into the cereal? And then cover crop termination always has to be considered. Is it going to be winter killed, or does it have to need a herbicide or tillage to terminate it? And the last thing is economics. Ryan talked about the livestock system. If you've got manure to feed that crop and you use it as feed, the economics certainly turns out quite well. If it's a cash crop system, then there's some intangibles that you're trying to work out. What is the benefit from it? Certainly a red clover crop provides a fair bit of nitrogen, can help with the economics there. Some of the other ones, you know, how much is the benefit to opening up the soil, to improving that soil structure? Those kinds of things are a bit more intangible, but in the long term can pay off in better yield. Next. Just some simple things, just kind of reiterating some of what Ryan showed that the Greenbelt participants were doing. Oats is certainly an inexpensive cover crop that can go in after cereals and early harvested crops up to mid-September or so. An improvement on that is a three-way mix with a spring cereal, a legume or a non-legume broadleaf mix. It's a less expensive mix and excuse me, gives you a variety of root systems in there, and often in a field, if one species isn't doing as well, the other species will jump in and help, help fill in the space. And then last, as Ryan mentioned, a lot of them are using cereal rye. It's very good that later season when the cereals are going to die off, the rye will grow over the winter, give you more cover over the winter and into the spring. It does need to be terminated in the spring, so that has to be considered and should be done a bit earlier before planting corn. Rye is very good at weed suppression, and also there's a number of growers that harvest it for feed and then plant another crop. Next. Just a few soil health resources. The Greenbelt Foundation has a page with quite a good range of soil health resources. OMAFA has a soil resources page with a lot of soils information and soil health information there. And then OSCIA, of course, has a lot of the incentive programs that can help with implementing BMPs.
Thank you, Adam. That was very interesting. And as we approach the end of this World Soil Day webinar, I'd like to take a minute to sort of revisit some of the take-home messages from today's session. We began with Jake and Dan talking about Ontario's journey toward building a Made in Ontario soil health test that we are at this very moment building. We're building the database, we're building the provincial lab capacity, and we're building the ability to interpret the soil health tests within this province. So pretty exciting. And of course, if you'd like to read the hot off the press topsoil report, it was released today and it's available through that link. Next, please. Then we learned a little bit about the Greenbelt Foundation, their soil health program from Jenny and Ryan, and then from Adam and their way of approaching the project. If you're a farmer or an advisor operating within the Greenbelt and you'd like to get involved with their program, you can email them using the address on the screen, and stay tuned because Ryan just might be planning an event in your area in 2025. And then finally, if you're located outside of the Greenbelt, but are operating within Ontario, you can get involved with the Soils at Guelph SHAP ground truthing project. We have the capacity to pay for the lab analysis of up to 1,000 soil health samples, thanks to a grant from the Weston Family Foundation Soil Health Initiative. And the way we've set up the program, the Greenbelt Foundation, they're going to take the sample for you and provide some of that value added stuff. But for us, we're going to work together with you where you take the soil sample and we pay for the lab fee. So if you have 5 fields that you'd like to sample, just let us know and we can pay for the analysis of those 5 fields. Or if you, as a certified crop advisor, and I've looked at the list, I know some of you have actually, I recognize your names from participating in our program over the last couple of years that we've been running it. But if, as a certified crop advisor, you'd like to work with 7 of your customers and offer to take samples of their fields, that works too. So just to get started, email that email address, soils@uoguelph.ca. Tell us how many fields you'd like to sample, what county you're located in, and then I'll send you the 4-step instructions for how to participate. And like they say, it's hard to manage what you can't measure. So these soil health tests are getting you one step further, getting one other data point that you can use to assess how healthy your soils are. Next, please. And so thanks again for attending our Made in Ontario Soil Health Testing webinar to celebrate World Soil Day 2024. And for all you just tuning in, we join you in celebrating soil. It's, as my kids love to say, it's so cool. It's so cool, right? Thank you for attending, for your attention, and let's stay connected because it's always better that way. Thanks again.